public support for Canada's foreign aid sector in the time of COVID-19. Bonjour et bienvenue au webinaire du Réseau de coordination des conseils, le soutien public à l'aide internationale au Canada à l'époque de la COVID-19. My name is Sherry Stevenson, and I'm the National Program Manager for the Inter-Council Network, and I'll be your host today. Before we begin, there are a few technical items to note. So first, we are a bilingual organization, and today's webinar will be in both English and French. We have simultaneous interpretation available. So to select your preferred language, you'll find a globe icon at the bottom of your screen for the interpretation, which you can use to select the language you'd like to listen to. Nous sommes une organisation bilingue et ce webinaire se déroule en français et en anglais. Nous avons l'interprétation simultanée. Alors, pour sélectionner votre langue préférée, vous trouverez une icône représentant un globe terrestre au bas de votre écran. Cliquez là-dessus pour sélectionner la langue dans laquelle vous souhaitez écouter le webinaire. You can also select the language of the screen you would like to see in order to view the PowerPoint presentation in either French or English. So to do this, you go to the top of your screen and click on View Options. You will then see two options below Shared Screens. Again, select your language of preference. For the English presentation, it's under Spencer Henson, and for the French, select Présentation en français. If you have any difficulties with the interpretation, the screen views, closed captioning, or any other technical issues, just reach out to us in the chat and we'll do our best to help resolve them as quickly as possible. Avant de commencer, j'aimerais vous présenter brièvement le réseau de coordination des conseils. Le réseau est une coalition regroupant les 8 conseils provinciaux et régionaux pour la coopération internationale. Ces conseils luttent pour la promotion de la justice sociale et du changement social à travers le monde, et représentant plus de 350 organisations de la société civile diverses à travers le pays, d'un océan à l'autre. Les conseils sont des leaders dans l'engagement du public et le réseau offre une plateforme nationale qui permet aux conseils de collaborer pour améliorer leur efficacité et identifier des priorités communes en matière d'action collective. Pour en savoir plus sur le travail du réseau, s'il vous plaît, veuillez consulter notre site web ou nous suivre sur les médias sociaux. Finally, before we delve into today's content, we would like to acknowledge that we are hosting this webinar in Mi'kmaq. This is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship, which Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and Passamaquoddy peoples first signed with the British Crown in 1726. We ask that we all consider this today and the land on which we walk as we participate in this webinar. We feel it's important to keep this in mind and to know and to honor the land that we're on. The ICN works with many communities across Canada, including First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities, as well as communities around the world in the international development sector. And we feel it's important to reflect on this, draw lessons from our colonial history, and how this history intersects in many ways with issues we are facing today in working towards a more just, equitable, and sustainable world. So I'd like to invite everyone participating in the webinar to share what land you are on today during this webinar. So please feel free to put that into the chat. Je vais maintenant présenter nos panélistes et expliquer ce qui se passera tout au long du webinaire. Tout d'abord, Spencer Henson fera une brève présentation de certaines des conclusions de ses récentes recherches sur le soutien public à l'aide. Ensuite, nous entendrons les réponses et les analyses de Maïka Sondarjee et Barbara Grantham. Ensuite, nous aurons l'occasion pour vous tous, participants au webinaire, d'engager et participer à la discussion en accordant environ 10 à 15 minutes pour rejoindre des sous-groupes pour discuter de vos propres réactions et analyses de ce que vous avez entendu. Ensuite, nous reviendrons ensemble pour les questions et les discussions avec les panélistes. So our first speaker presenting his research is Spencer Henson. He is a professor in the Guelph Institute of Development Studies and Department of Food, Agricultural, and Resource Economics at the University of Guelph. His research interests are focused on food insecurity and on public support for development. He has undertaken research worked extensively with bilateral and multilateral donors and civil society organizations around the world. Currently, he's leading a research program on public understanding and support for development in Canada, including attitudes towards aid and the propensity to make donations to civil society organizations working internationally. Notre prochaine panéliste sera Maïka Sondarjee. Elle est professeure adjointe à l'École de développement international et mondialisation de l'Université d'Ottawa. En 2020, elle était boursière postdoctorale Banting au département de sciences politiques de l'Université de Montréal. Ses recherches portaient sur l'inclusion des populations locales dans l'élaboration des politiques à la Banque mondiale, le renforcement du pouvoir des femmes en Asie du Sud, la gouvernance mondiale, ainsi que les théories féministes et du développement. Son premier livre, Perdre le Sud, décoloniser la solidarité internationale, a été publié récemment en 2020. Then finally, our final panelist is Barbara Grantham. She is the president and CEO of CARE Canada. She has 30 years experience as a successful senior executive and consultant in the philanthropic, nonprofit, and public sectors. She has held executive positions with some of Canada's foremost nonprofit organizations, including the BC Children's Hospital Foundation, the Canadian Mental Health Association, and the Vancouver Foundation. In 2016, Barbara was named one of Women's Executive Network's annual Top 100 Most Powerful Women in Canada. Most recently, she received the 2019 AFP Lifetime Achievement in Fundraising Award in recognition of her decades of philanthropic leadership. She holds a BA degree from Queen's University and a master's in public administration from Carleton University. So without any further ado, I would like to hand it over to our speakers and hear what they have to say. So Spencer, it's over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Even though I'm at the University of Guelph, I'm actually speaking to you from Ottawa. So I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking actually today from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. So I'm going to talk to you over the next few minutes about public support for aid in the time of COVID-19. I, as part of a very varied research program, I have been undertaking research for quite a while now that aims to understand what are the key drivers of public support for aid and for personal donations, etc., related to development in Canada. This is an area of research which is really quite lacking in Canada compared, for example, to Europe. You know, relatively little about the drivers in a Canadian context, and so the work I'm doing aims to reveal, at least provide some revelation of what those drivers are. I'm today going to particularly focus on three key questions. They're very big questions and they're very complex questions. So I'm only going to be able to scrape the surface, but I'm going to explore, first of all, does the public in Canada support Canada's aid program? Secondly, if so, or if not, what are the drivers of that support or lack of it? And then look at the impact that COVID-19 has had on all of this. I'm going to particularly present to you the results of a survey that we undertook towards the end of July this year of a representative sample of Canadian adults, so those aged 18 plus. And it's actually a survey that we're going to be repeating very, very, very soon. So if at the end of this you had some ideas of things that we should cover, then we would love to hear from you. So turning to the first question, how do Canadians feel about Canada's aid program? And in particularly, do they think we should spend more or less on aid than we currently do? This is a very typical question that is put in surveys on public support for aid in many, many countries, in the United States, in various European countries, and actually in previous surveys in Canada. And it goes something along the lines of, looking to the future, do you think Canada should spend more, less, or about the same as it currently does on aid to developing countries? And what you'll see, and this is very typical of the picture that we typically find, you find that roughly, a third-ish of people think we should increase, roughly a third-ish think it should stay the same, and roughly a third-ish think it should increase. Sometimes there are more people think we should increase, we should stay the same, we should reduce, but it isn't that surveys typically show huge differences in the proportions of people that respond in this way. So yeah, and these were the results we got. They're fairly typical. What is interesting about this question, though, is that if you ask it in a different way, you actually get very different results. And so that means that we have to put some question marks around data like this. So for example, we also asked this question in this form. So instead of focusing in on aid, we said, okay, let's think about what the federal government spends money on and say, how do you think the amount it spends on these 13 areas should change in the next 2 to 3 years? The benefit of this approach is it puts forward to respondents the fact that there are choices here. Unless you're going to spend more overall, if you spend more on one area, you're likely going to spend less on other areas. And so it recognizes that there are trade-offs, that there's a broader context here. Unfortunately, however, if you ask in this way, what you will see is that actually now only 18% of people think we should increase aid spending. And actually 42% of people think we should actually reduce it. And so this shows that actually support for aid spending is really pretty tenuous. It's really pretty shaky. And we'll come back to that as we progress. What drives whether people think we should spend money on aid, whether we should spend more on aid, less on aid? Well, sentiment, people's support for one view or another on this reflects actually a very complex trade-off. On the one hand, between the reasons why we should do it, and we're going to come to those first in a minute. So why should Canada spend money on aid to developing countries? That's this. And then against this, the hard realities. If we're going to do that, then what are we not going to do? Or, can we afford it, for example? And we're going to come to that afterwards. And so what you'll see, and we look at this in very complex statistical ways, but I'm going to not use that. But regardless of how you look at it, you will see that there is this complex and very awkward trade-off going on between, yes, there are good reasons to do this, but acting against that are hard realities. So we're going to look at each of these elements in turn as I go through. First of all, then, the reasons to do it. First of all, the moral imperative. And this is a very typical question in surveys globally on support for aid. And it basically is about the moral imperative. And what we know is that if you think there is a moral imperative, a duty to do this, that tends to push you more towards support aid and supporting increases in spending. And what you'll see in our survey, just about over half of people said, yeah, absolutely, I agree with that. We do have a duty. Relatively few people, okay, say, no, I disagree. Okay, and so this tends to be something that is driving people to say, yeah, I support us spending money on aid. So that's the first thing. Then there is the, how does this fit with being a Canadian? And so, for example, do you feel pride knowing that Canada gives aid to developing countries? How does that make you feel? And we found around, 57% of people said, yeah, I agree with this. Yeah, it makes me feel good as a Canadian, knowing that we give aid to developing countries. And very few people disagree with that. Okay, and again, this tends to push people towards supporting spending on aid. But at the same time, contrary to that sort of nationalistic view, I'm a Canadian, there's the idea that, no, actually, I'm more a global citizen than I am a Canadian. And we know that seeing yourself more as being global than national again tends to push people towards support for aid spending. However, what we see in our sample, and this is not atypical, is actually relatively few people see themselves in that way. There's actually a very strong feeling of national identity rather than global identity. And so you see actually getting on for half of people actually disagreed with this, and relatively few, not even a quarter, actually agreed with that. So that's the Canadian identity versus global identity reason to spend money on aid. Then there is the self-interest. Well, if we spend money elsewhere in the world, particularly if it's a relatively small amount, does it flow back to help us? So do we benefit? So it's basically a win-win. We help people in poorer parts of the world, but it also comes back to help us. And what you find is that actually, yeah, people can see that, but it's a fairly complex argument. And it isn't that people are overwhelmingly saying, yeah, I can see that it comes back to benefit us as well. And so actually, you've got only 37% of people, and actually very few people strongly agree with this. So 37% agree overall, only 6% strongly agree. A lot of people in the middle, and actually, quite a lot disagree with this idea. If we focus in on the specific benefits, because now this is saying to people, okay, let's think hard and fast about how Canada may benefit, what you'll see is people can tend to picture this more. Very few people, that's the blue here, think there's a very positive impact. So most are willing to say, yeah, there's some positive impact, but very few people say it's really, really, really strong. And the biggest impacts are seen as very soft things like Canada's reputation in the world, or our understanding of other parts of the world. They tend to be, the really tangible things like benefits to business, for example, or our security or our political influence tend to be a lot weaker. Now let's come to, presumably the real reason why a lot of people think we give aid, and that is it actually benefits those who we're aiming to benefit, the poorest people in the world. Unfortunately, a lot of people think it doesn't actually get to those people. So when we asked, we said most aid never gets to those who need it most. 60% of people agreed with this. Okay, remember this number. We're gonna come back to it. Okay, and what we know is that if you tend to agree with a statement like this, it drives you to be against spending on aid, and particularly spending more on aid. Okay. We also asked, okay, but does it matter who delivers the aid? Okay. So is it that you think some are more effective than others because ultimately somebody is delivering the aid, is actually spending the money and actually delivering services and support, etc. Now, there are sort of two messages from this slide. Unfortunately, very few people think anyone is very effective. That's the blue down here. Okay, if we chuck in somewhat effective, which is a sort of far looser and less robust idea, then who comes out well? Canadian NGOs and international organizations, the two extremes here, because 50% of people think they're effective. Very few very effective, but they are effective. NGOs in developing countries, less so, but still, you know, quite significant. Businesses, they think, have far less effectiveness. Okay, so yeah, they think probably most aid doesn't get. I don't believe most aid gets the people most in need, but I do at least think some organizations are more effective than others. None are very effective. Has it worked? We asked, what's happened to the number of poor people in the world, in poorer countries over the last 10 to 15 years? And we know these numbers have come down quite significantly. This isn't what people think. People actually think over 60% of people thought that over the last 10 to 15 years, the number of poor people in the world have gone up. Okay, and this is an interesting slide because what does it say to people? Oh, well, we spent a lot on aid and the number of people in poverty has gone up, then it doesn't work. That's one interpretation. The other is, oh, wow, we still got a huge job to do here, so we better spend more. And of course, people can flip between those and different people can interpret it in different ways. If we ask about specific impacts, so now trying to get in to say, okay, let's think about what those impacts might potentially be. So we're now trying to get to people, let's not think of the broad, you know, the intangible, let's think of the tangible. Then you'll see here that very few people, and this is Canada's aid program, very few people think there's been a very positive impact. You know, none of these, you know, are even at 10%. Okay, if we, you know, loosen it up and say, you know, some positive impact, then people say, okay, then I think, yeah, health, probably, access to education, okay, recovery from natural disasters, okay, and to a lesser extent, women, lives of women and girls, and food security, and then some of the others like climate change, for example, or the capacity of government, far, far less. So people can at least think about that it may have had a positive impact, maybe not huge, okay, but they can think in their minds that, yeah, I can think of that it may have had impacts in these ways. Now, one thing that we've been looking a lot at is the notion that support for aid actually reflects, and we are finding very strongly, why people think there are poor people in developing countries. Why are they poor? Because aid is only going to have any impact if it addresses the reasons why people are poor. Okay. And in our work, we've been looking, and I'm not going to go into details about how, at essentially, we found 4 key reasons why people think people are poor in developing countries. The most frequently cited reason is they got bad government, they're corrupt, they waste money, they're ineffective. Okay, and around 45% of people think that's a reason. Okay, and a strong reason. That's here. Next is global exploitation. They're exploited by multinationals, by rich people, by rich countries, etc. So basically, you know, the world is against them. Okay, and around 35% of people think that's a reason. Okay. Coming across, development context, lack of access to education, to health, climate, poor soils, etc., gender inequalities. You know, this is the development context, okay, which a lot of aid is actually focused at. Only 22% of people agreed that that was the reason. And then there's the poor themselves. They're lazy, they're uneducated, okay, they don't know better. These are very unsavory views, and luckily, at least, only 10% of people actually think that that's the reason that the people are poor. Now, if we now put on this, what should happen to aid spending then? What we find is this, that if we look at the biggest reason people think that people are poor, bad government, if this is what you think, you tend to be in favor of cutting aid spending. Why are we going to spend money in countries with corrupt governments? That's what people think. If you think it's about global exploitation, however, the second most important reason, then yes, that tends to drive you to support increases in aid spending, because very much on the argument of sort of guilt or on bringing systemic change, okay? Coming across, if you believe it's the development context, it's about health and education, et cetera, yeah, that tends to drive you to support increases in aid spending. But unfortunately, you know, a smaller number of people support that idea. If you think it's the poor themselves, you know, they're to blame, then that tends to drive you to be against aid spending. Luckily, relatively few people support that notion, that they think that's a legitimate reason why people are poor. So why people think people are poor really matters. Now let's chuck COVID-19 into the mix. Okay, and we asked people, okay, so COVID-19 has happened. How important do you think the aid is that Canada gives to developing countries in the context of COVID-19? How important is it to the global fight against the pandemic, to protecting Canadians against COVID-19, and protecting Canadians against future infectious diseases, other infectious diseases in the future? And what you'll see here is actually less than 20% in every case think it's very important, but overall important, we're talking about, you know, 55, 60%, and in the case of future diseases, over 60% say, yes, it's important. Okay, so people can see the importance of aid in terms of the fight against COVID globally, protecting Canadians, and connecting Canadians in the future against other infectious diseases. They get that. But if you get to specifics and say, okay, of all the things, of all the actions that we might take to protect Canadians against COVID-19, so this is a self-interest argument, what matters most? Top, vaccines. Developing vaccines and making sure vaccines are available to everyone in the world come out top. And that's a good thing. However, if we then talk about how about investing in the health systems in developing countries, far less so. You can see here that the importance, the very importance here is now below 30%. Far more important is robust health systems at home and putting up the borders. That is checking people as they come through the border. Okay, so it's very much a vaccine and about, you know, making sure we have the controls at home rather than investing in other parts of the world. We also asked, okay, how has COVID-19 changed the need for Canada to provide aid to developing countries? Okay, overall. And we find here that around 32% actually think, yeah, it's increased the case. Around 28% of people say, actually, it's reduced the case. And then the middle, getting on for 40%, say has made no change. And so it isn't that people are saying, yeah, COVID-19, that has really enhanced the case for aid. Some people think that, but less than a third. And if we ask them, what about your own support for the aid that Canada gives to developing countries? Only 20% of people said that it had increased their support for aid. Over half it had no impact. And even a greater proportion, almost a quarter, said it had reduced their support for aid. So this is pretty tenuous, the impact of COVID-19 on how Canadians see aid. Okay, now let's get to the hard realities. Unfortunately, we've not already presented a really compelling case in the mind of Canadians to spend money on aid. So this is the positive drivers, okay? And now we're going to chuck in the other, the hard reality edge to the sword. First of all, there is, okay, but we got plenty of problems at home. We know there are high rates of poverty in Canada, in urban areas, in indigenous populations, etc. So, you know, should we prioritize those first? Almost 60% of people say yes. Remember that number. We're going to come back to it in a minute. And actually, relatively few people disagree with that. So there's very much a mentality of let's prioritize action at home first, rather than other parts of the world. And then we come to the harsh economic realities, particularly in the context of COVID. Can we actually afford to spend more, given the state of the government's finances, or not? 58% of people said, no, I agree with this. And actually, again, relatively few people said no. And again, remember those numbers, okay? Now, what is particularly troubling when it comes to the harsh realities is that often there's an assumption then, okay, those people who support aid, okay, they're the ones who tend to disagree that we can't afford it. They're the ones who tend to disagree that it doesn't get to the people who are most in need. They're the ones who tend to disagree that we should prioritize problems at home first. And it's those who are anti who hold those views. Unfortunately, it isn't quite as easy as that. What I have shown on this slide is these are people who indicated we should increase aid spending. And these are the people who indicated we should cut aid spending. And I've left out the no change people here, just to make it clearer. And you can see here, 80% of people, and this is probably not surprising to you, who said we should cut aid spending, said we can't afford it. But unfortunately, so did 41% of the people who said we should increase aid spending. So yeah, a significantly lower proportion, but it isn't like they all said, no, we can afford it. 41% of people said we can't, even though they could see the case for increasing aid spending. Let's go back to that number earlier. Remember, it's around 60% of people who said it doesn't get to those who need it. And what do we find? Those who say we should cut aid spending, yeah, a lot higher proportion of those say, yeah, of course it doesn't get to those who need it most. 77% of them actually. But amongst those who said we should increase aid spending, 57% of those said it doesn't get to those who need it most. So it isn't as easy as to say, if you agree with this, you're likely to be in favor of cutting aid spending. Okay, so we have a very complex terrain here. So what I've done is present to you some, I've bombarded you with data, and I'm sure you're going to have lots and lots of questions and comments and maybe disagreements over this, okay? And because I've been looking at, individual questions, I haven't looked at the complex interplay between them. And it is very, very complex. This trade-off between the drivers of why we should give aid and the harsh realities. So the implications are, unfortunately, support for aid is actually very tenuous. There are actually very few people who say, absolutely, we should increase aid spending, no doubt, no argument against at all. And the reason is the support reflects an actual very complex trade-off of attitudes, and that many people in their mind have conflicting views of aid, affordability, of impact, of whether it gets to those who need it most, etc. And it's how they feel reflects actually a very complex trade-off in their mind. Chucking COVID, yeah, Canadians see the need for aid in the context of COVID, but it isn't that this has had a huge impact on the support that they have for aid. they see that aid is there. They see it's important. They see it has a role, for example, in vaccines, absolutely. But they equally see the protection against Canadians against COVID is very much going to come from putting up the borders and investing at home, and far less about, okay, investing elsewhere in the world. Okay, I'm going to leave it there and leave it to my colleagues to give their reflection and ideas, and I'm sure we'll have a very vibrant conversation and debate.
Thank you, Spencer. That's great. Yeah, there's lots of information in there, lots for us to think about. So why don't we pass it over to Maïka Sondarjee now for her perspective on all this.
Merci beaucoup, Sherry. Merci, Spencer, de cette présentation. C'était extrêmement stimulant et d'ailleurs, comme c'était si stimulant, je pense que ça va être la présentation la plus éclectique que j'ai fait dans les derniers mois parce qu'il y a tellement... idéalement, on se serait assis autour d'une bouteille de vin pour en discuter, mais ce sera après la crise, j'en ai bien peur. Donc, mes commentaires vont évidemment être en lien avec ce que Spencer Henson vient de nous présenter et aussi, je tiens à dire, là, dans le contexte du lancement cette semaine du cadre pour l'antiracisme dans le secteur. Donc, je faisais partie de l'équipe de travail qui a été lancée par Coopération Canada. Donc, on a développé un cadre qui va être sorti plus officiellement cette semaine. Je vous invite à aller le voir et le signer. Les organisations de coopération canadienne sont invitées à le signer. Et je pense que ça démontre que le secteur est dans un processus de changement, que c'est important de se poser certaines questions par rapport au narratif qu'on propose, par rapport à comment on défend notre travail, par rapport à comment on explique notre travail à la population canadienne. Et la présentation de Spencer, je pense, nous aide à naviguer avec des données, naviguer ce changement qui est extrêmement important. Ça fait longtemps qu'on a pu avoir cette opportunité après les années noires de l'ère Harper. Donc, moi, ce que je trouvais le plus intéressant dans la présentation, en fait, c'est, on va souvent parler des gens qui appuient ou qui n'appuient pas ou qui sont en accord ou en désaccord, mais je trouve que la partie grise des diapositives, là où les gens ne sont ni en accord ni en désaccord ou ne sont pas certains, c'est là où on peut se permettre de jouer. Et c'est là où on peut avoir un impact sur le narratif en regardant les gens, les Canadiens, Canadiennes qui appuient l'aide, pourquoi ils l'appuient, mais après ça, on peut jouer. Il y a vraiment une grande possibilité de changement à cause de ce pourcentage-là de personnes qui ni est en accord, ni est en désaccord. Puis ça, pour moi, c'est une opportunité. Je pense qu'on doit la saisir plutôt que de se dire il n'y a pas de soutien envers les projets d'aide internationale. Je pense qu'on doit travailler sur convaincre les indécis. Et ce que je trouvais particulièrement intéressant, et c'est pourquoi ce type de recherche est extrêmement important, c'est la différence entre ce que les Canadiens et Canadiennes pensent ou ce en quoi ils croient et les attitudes politiques et les choix publicitaires ou communicationnels des organisations et du gouvernement canadien. Donc, on a vu que le sentiment d'être fier d'être Canadien, tout ça, évidemment, le sentiment d'identité nationale influence notre support à l'aide, au sens où notre image peut être importante pour notre support à agir davantage, être davantage un leader sur la scène internationale. Cette idée que l'aide internationale ou les efforts pour la COVID, par exemple, doivent absolument bénéficier des Canadiens et Canadiennes, de ce que je comprends des données, c'est que ce n'est pas nécessairement le cas. Il n'y a pas tant que ça un support important pour l'idée que...
This is not necessarily true for all people. For many people, in fact, there doesn't need to be a direct link. But when we hear Justin Trudeau's discourse, when we hear the discourse of other politicians in Canada, particularly in the context of COVID, it's focused a lot on we need to increase aid so that COVID doesn't come back to bite us in the rear. We need to help everyone in the world because that's good for us. It always comes back to our own self-interest, and it plays on an external risk that Canadians face that we need to be concerned about, fearful of. That's often what the discourse hints at. us also a lot about how we need to improve uh, gender equality so that we can create the kind of development in many countries that will allow those countries to become better economic partners for Canada, not because it's good in and of itself. So that's a narrative that really focuses on justifying to Canadians why it's in our self-interest. And those are the lines that are often sort of underlined the most in this kind of communication strategy. Another point that's very interesting in this regard is how Canadians support, particularly within the current crisis, access to vaccines. You know, people are generally in agreement that we should vaccinate a certain percentage of the world's population so that we protect ourselves and we protect everyone. But, you know, more developed countries like Canada, we feel it's okay to vaccinate ourselves first, that we be first in line, and that we're kind of skirting around or not truly respecting the spirit of COVAX by doing that, even though we pay good lip service to COVAX. So why do we do it? We do it of self-interest, but at the end of the day, it's not necessarily what Canadians want if they were questioned more deeply about this issue. Then the slide that I found the most interesting in Spencer's presentation, why do people think that countries need international aid? I think it was, you know, because of the developmental context, because there are bad, corrupt governments, because there were a number of different possibilities there. I'm not a statistician myself, but those who were at one end of the issue was a small group. There wasn't one reason that predominated over the others, which was interesting to me. And so the discourse that we should focus on then is the one that shows that if you believe that that is the reason, that leads to underdevelopment, that leads to poverty, then we should increase spending. Canadians are ready then to hear these arguments. They're open to them, not just narratives around misery and abject poverty and, you know, these kinds of narratives that kind of lead to an inevitability that this is the way it is, and we throw up our hands and there's nothing we can do, but not playing on that, but rather playing on the field of Canadians' openness with regards to other narratives. You know, there are the narratives around white saviors. When we think of a narrative that we should propose as a sector, you know, targeting different parts of the Canadian population, we have to not only think about communication strategies, but not only in terms of communication strategies, because a narrative does not only reflect what the population thinks or believes deeply, but it also participates in changing that point of view, in changing attitudes and mentalities. And what Spencer reveals then in his research is that there are many Canadians who are kind of ambivalent. They're somewhere in the middle. Their positions are not clearly articulated, and we can then have an influence through you know, the anti-racism movement and other movements that are very much on the front burner right now around colonialism and decolonizing. We can change our strategies, use the research that we've heard today to change mentalities and attitudes, hearts and minds in a direction that, of course, we want to see them going, and hence provide more support to foreign aid in a way that is not negatively impacting sort of the moral side of the equation that underpins this narrative. lack of development, that we should help them because they need our help, those kinds of ideas, sort of more Canadian ethical, traditional ethical arguments. It may appeal to a certain Canadian sensibility, but it's not necessarily a bad thing to show the relationship between Canada and a broader multilateral context where Canada has an impact in decisions that are made with regards to aid envelopes. I'm going to stop there because I want to hear your reactions. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Maïka. Oui, on apprécie vos commentaires.
Thank you, Mike. We appreciate your...
C'est la parole à Barbara.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Sherry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, just want to make sure. Thank you, Sherry. And thank you also, Spencer, for such a thought-provoking presentation. And thank you, Maïka, for your comments, which have, even in this short time, really spurred my thinking. And now I'm looking at my notes going, gosh, I'm not sure I'm up for this. I'll just say that I am actually in British Columbia today, and I'm privileged to be on the lands of Coast Salish peoples, particularly the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. Very honored to be with all of you today on these unceded ancestral territories. First of all, I just want to repeat maybe en anglais and really reinforce Maïka's comments about the anti-racism framework and the work that the sector is doing as a family of civil society organizations here in Canada to really address and have forward-facing conversations about the underlying racism within the sector, not only here in Canada, but certainly within a global context as well. And so I would really maybe reinforce Maïka's encouragement and invite all of you to join in the conversation that Cooperation Canada is so bravely undertaking on behalf of all of us. Maybe what I'm coming at this perspective, unlike Spencer and Mike, I'm not an academic, gave up those aspirations a long time ago, but maybe I'm positing my comments today from the perspective as a leader of one of Canada's larger civil society organizations, an international organization. CARE is part of an international confederation. But I also will maybe add a little qualification to my comments in that I'm, in relative terms, and certainly compared to many of you in this gathering today, very, very new to kind of the specific ecosystem of international development. I've been active in the Canadian nonprofit ecosystem for many, many years. But what strikes me, because I started my work with CARE on April the 1st of 2020, just at the very onset of COVID. And in fact, it's been a fairly fascinating time to come into an international organization at the onset and through this first year of an unprecedented time, not only for Canada, but for the world as well. So I may be coming at it with maybe from a positive vein, fresh eyes. Others might say naive eyes. So I guess that maybe that's a dilemma that we'll resolve as we move through this conversation. But what strikes me as a newcomer in some ways to this endeavor, and I'm looking at this, as I said, as the lens of a leader of a Canadian-based international organization whose mission is to bring about a more equal world, and in large measure to achieve that by working in developing contexts to lift up the well-being of women and girls. But there are some realities, I think, that all of us in this sector, from a non-governmental perspective, need to be very clear about. And Spencer and Maïka have both touched on these, but I think it helps to be really, really clear about the challenges that we face. The first, and these are all factual realities that we face. The first is that COVID has left not only all of us in this country, but obviously within a global context with a deeply gendered impact of this pandemic. And by virtually every single indicator of well-being, as a globe, we have fallen behind, and within a Canadian and even North American context, we have fallen behind. I think it's fair to say, as a Canadian, we will come through this crisis. There is work to do. There will be aspects of our overall progress as a Canadian society where we have work to do in the years to come, but we will come through. Many, many countries of this world and many, many vulnerable populations will not be able to say that unless there is a transfer of resources from those countries that have and are coming through it to those that are less likely to be the case. That's reality number one. Reality number two, and I think lots of us know this both intuitively and factually, but Spencer's recent research I think really brings home for us, is that as a sector we have a credibility issue. There are fairly interesting disconnects between what people believe and what we know the reality and the facts to be. And there are widely disparate opinions amongst the population in this country about the role that Canada should have in the world. And by virtue of that, the role that many of our civil society organizations should have. So that credibility issue, I guess for me, and that issue of disconnects is number two. And number three, in a more global context, I think many NGOs that work in the international space are in somewhat of what I would carefully call an existential crisis, in that we are increasingly being challenged as organizations that have largely come out of a post-World War II framework and value proposition of how we do good work in the world, are now being called actively, fairly loudly, in my opinion, rightly, to take a dramatically different approach to our work, in which we are being asked to quickly, skillfully, and in no small measure confront and address the racism within the sector and the colonial underpinnings of this work. And that represents, for many organizations that have been founded on some core principles and ways of doing the work, we're all confronted with some fairly fundamental questions about how we move forward. And COVID has brought all of that conversation really to a very sharp and fairly compelling head. And so I think this research is all the more useful for us, Spencer, because it really gives us as civil society organizations here in Canada a chance to take a very deep breath and say, so in light of that larger global existential crisis about how we continue to do this work, but in a profoundly different way, and in light of the disparate views here within Canada and that issue of credibility, ambivalence, and disconnection within the Canadian context, and within the reality of a wounded world, a wounded planet coming out of COVID, how do we take those three broad challenges and as a group of, in relative terms, small-ish, but mighty in spirit civil society organizations, how do we move forward? And I think that's the conversation that I'm hoping we can move through and have with all of you today. I think there's a fundamental rethink that we need to do as civil society organizations about how we want to move through into a new era. I think I'll put forward three thoughts that maybe when we move into conversation would be a little bit of a way to spark the conversation. There's first of all some fundamental work to do in working with the Canadian political class, both elected and public servants, to fundamentally reform the regulatory and financing environment for civil society organizations and truly enable us to work with local partners in developing contexts to bring a much higher value for dollar to those local contexts that would in part address that existential question and would in part address that credibility issue with Canadians. The second is to, in a more practical way, really revisit, frankly, a business model that many of us have had for a long time to fairly rapidly and dramatically reform our organizations, to restructure our individual organizations and to restructure ourselves as a sector, to look less, and I'll say this sort of somewhat flippantly, but I don't intend it that way. It's less about us putting on a backpack and going there, wherever there may be. That is going to happen less and less in this new world. And it'll be more and more about Canadian NGOs and Canadian investors, public and private, bringing together those resources where we can deploy them to other parts of the world that for a whole host of reasons can do good things to lift up this planet. But we will increasingly be using smaller Canadian organizations, transferring more of those resources into those local environments, using digital and technological innovations to deliver them with far greater efficiency, and being able to measure and report and tell Canadians about the impact of that work in a much more evocative way. Which takes me to the third. And that is, I think, fundamentally thinking about how we tell our story. That's maybe a marketing term, or reframe, if I can put it that way, the value proposition that we want to share with Canadians. If nothing else, for me as a citizen, one of the very, very few upsides, if I can put it that way, of COVID is that it has shown every Canadian how deeply interconnected a world we live in. And whether one wants to look at that through the lens of the climate change, through food security and supply chains, through the fact that we live in a world now where you can jump on a plane and be halfway around the world within less than a day. The fact is that we live in a deeply interconnected world. That fact isn't going to change. What we can change is how, as Canadians, we take a small but powerful part of the resources that we have to bring to bear to make the conditions of the planet better so that all of us can continue to move around this fragile planet and save this fragile planet in a meaningful way. I believe, based on the research that Spencer and his colleagues, and in fact, many of the public opinion enterprises over the years have done, those fundamental core beliefs that we have about ourselves as Canadians hold true. I believe we've come out of this pandemic with those values holding true. And the generosity of Canadians through this pandemic has demonstrated that those values hold true. But I think if we undertake those three things that I've lightly touched on, that gives us a good platform, along with those core values, for us to be able to have meaningful conversations with Canadians going forward. Thank you. Merci.
Thanks, Barbara. Some more food for thought for us to think about. This is great. All these very interesting questions to pose to us. We have about 10 minutes left for our webinar, and we'd like to invite any questions from the groups, from the audience. So if you have any questions you'd like to ask our panelists, if you want to put them into the chat or let me know. Michel Aslan?
Oui, je pense que ça va être plus vite si je le dis. Peut-être aux trois panélistes, on a parlé dans les statistiques qu'il y a de nos concitoyens, concitoyennes qui opposaient l'aide internationale au fait qu'on devait lutter contre la pauvreté au Canada ou au
that we
Québec.
had to fight against poverty in Canada. And we think that this vision should not be opposed. Yes, we have to fight poverty. We have to talk about impact of climate change throughout the world, but we know that the impact is different for some populations in Canada, and there are global economic issues that have an influence on their life, wherever it is in the world and in Canada. So we need a strategy to get together and to work on universality. It's not well understood by the public, including our colleagues in the social movements in Quebec and Canada. And so this crisis, this pandemic will end, but there will be other ones. So how can we face a major global crisis together? With Canadians as well, people that are worried about this kind of situation. So who answers these questionnaires? If I answer and I'm in a situation of poverty, I will have another opinion. So I don't know whether it should be another research, but people who are going through difficulties usually show more solidarity. So but we didn't have time to talk about a lot of things. We had lots of topics. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Michelle.
Maïka, Spencer, Barbara, vous voulez répondre?
Oui, je peux peut-être commencer comme j'ai compris la langue peut-être mieux que Barbara et Spencer. Excellent point.
So, excellent idea, Michelle. We've already talked about that, and I totally agree with you. We should, and it goes back to my point, how the narrative is important to change mentalities. We saw that it was going the other way. Recently, everybody was against globalization and exploitation and against the whole system. But at the same time, people will want less international aid and less government and so on. So all of this is a question of framing, because we all agree that international aid could play a role, but we have to reformulate what we promote. We have a common humanity, we have a common narrative, there's a universality in human condition. Well, yeah, it's moral and ethic to go in that direction, and we have to try and choose strategies so that people understand that it's not us against them, and you cannot compare with our other budgets, such as defense budget, for instance. So these are things that people should understand, because they haven't yet. They haven't understood all that. Yeah, it's a good point.
Okay, merci, Maïka. We have another question in the panel, maybe in the chat from Kimberly Gibbons, saying she found the presentation insightful and wanted to ask about reframing the research or the polling to understand better how Canadians respond to questions that are framed in the language of cooperation and solidarity. Would either of you have any comments on that? Or sorry, Cam, did you want to say it?
I just wanted to expand. We started in our breakout, I was starting to ask this question in a way that I think we are also reinforcing a narrative by continuing to ask that, and by continuing to put forward advocacy campaigns that talk about aid, or to have branding exercises that promote aid. So how does the framing of the research also reframe our own analysis and perspective of the sector from inside, and also how does it shape public perception? So I think these are critical, and they relate to Barbara's points about working with elected and bureaucratic class, as well as looking at ourselves and how we understand ourselves as a sector.
Would anyone like to tackle that one?
Maybe Spencer should address the question about the framing of the research.
Yeah, and actually there was a earlier question in the chat about what other research might be taking place too that influences how Canadians form their views. So is there maybe other research or the framing of those kind of things?
One thing we've been doing in the research we are engaged with is gathering data from other surveys, and we've been very successful at doing that. And there are a number of surveys have been done and are ongoing. Most surveys in this area tend to not go into huge amounts of depth because of the cost of doing it and etc. Unfortunately, we don't have any mechanism by which this is done on an ongoing basis. So, for example, in the US and in 4 European countries actually, there is a large study being going on for a number of years that surveys on a regular basis, and we're not part of that, which is unfortunate. I think the framing thing is very important, but of course it's not assumed that just because we frame it in a particular way that people are going to understand what we're talking about, or that we're going to get the response that we want to get. So for example, if we talk about global interdependencies, and that's one thing that COVID has done, it has also shown global vulnerabilities, including of us. And, we can show that COVID, and I think people understand that COVID-19 has come because of global interdependencies. But one way in which people can respond to that is by putting up the borders, not by cooperating more, but actually doing the opposite. And we can't be sure that that is how people are going to respond. Different people will respond in different ways. So I think it's an extremely complex terrain. I certainly think, the reframing is very important, and we need to investigate how framing affects people's response. We have done work on looking at how we frame how much we spend on aid, what metrics we use. We know that affects how people see aid. Absolutely. But we also know that people know relatively little about Canada's aid program, and they often exaggerate how much Canada spends. But don't assume, if you then tell them how wrong they are, that they suddenly start saying, oh, we should spend more money. They don't. So yes, they do misunderstand how much we spend, but it isn't that when we tell them, oh, actually you spend half as much as you think we do, that they then all say, oh, that's okay, then let's spend more. It's not as simple as that at all. So, but no, I think the framing thing is very important, absolutely. And we know how framing will affect people's responses, but not always in the way we anticipate or we want to see.
Okay,
can I suggest another way to come at it? Because I totally appreciate your comments, Spencer. We could talk, it's not even lunchtime here in Vancouver. We could talk from now until sunset, because it's actually a sunny day, which almost never happens in January. But we could talk for a long time about how to frame research questions for polling. But let me encourage all of us who are kind of the practitioners, the non-academics, to look at 2 or 3 really concrete examples in the last few months, in the last year, that show through behavior the values that we espouse as Canadians, and use those to help us do that reframing of that public conversation. And let me give Let me give 3 examples, maybe 4. The first is giving. Canadians have continued to give individually, through foundations, through corporations. Canadians have continued to give to local and international and national organizations through this pandemic. That tells us something. That fact alone tells us something. Number 2, Canadians still want to travel. Now, I know that is a bit of a mixed blessing in this particular kind of public discourse moment, because it's gotten certain people into trouble. But the fact that people still want to see the world, people still want to go to other places, people still want to explore, I think that's a great sign that as Canadians, we still want to be out in the world. Number 3, the public acceptance of bringing newcomers into this country has not changed. In fact, if anything, as I understand it from informal evidence, it's gone up through this pandemic. That fact serves us extraordinarily well as a Canadian society going forward. Number 4, the ESG behavior, for lack of a better word, of the corporate citizenry of Canada, and in fact globally through this pandemic, by virtually every measure has increased. That is a very important indicator of where the corporate mindset believes the broader public mindset to be doing. And I think we should see that, whether one espouses that or not, it's an important proxy for where the corporate marketplace believes the underlying Canadian attitudes and behaviors are moving.
Thanks, Barbara. That's great. Well, it's actually 3:30 on the dot here in Halifax, and I want to respect people's time. So I think that we should bring the webinar to a close. But I just want to thank you all for being here, and thank you very much to our panelists for your thoughtful remarks. It's really been a pleasure. Thanks to Spencer for sharing your research findings. And posing some critical pieces for us to think about. And thanks to Maïka and Barbara for sharing your perspectives and really contributing to the analysis and discussion today. I also want to thank the ICN team, particularly for the communications and promotional support and the technical support today in getting the webinar organized and set up. And of course, to everyone who joined us, yes, thanks for engaging and sticking it out an hour and a half in your discussion groups and hearing the panelists. And we'll hope to see you again at another ICN event in the future. So again, keep your eyes out on our website and our social media for what we have coming up next. And for any colleagues that you know of, you'll be able to share the recording of this webinar with them if they've missed it today. So thanks again, everyone. Merci beaucoup à tout le monde. Et à bientôt.